Hey everybody, today's update is on a really interesting article that was sent to me called The Four-Dimensional Brain with a question mark after it. Now this is from it's actually from Discover, but it's a neuroskeptic blog post, an article, like more of an opinion kind of thing. This is an absolutely fascinating topic. As it turns out, researchers Arturo Tosi and James F. Peters have just released a paper that seems to state the human brain might actually operate in four spatial dimensions instead of only three. Yet, of course, as is typical in scientific circles, the paper is in no way written for the layman and is incredibly difficult to understand the consequences of what this could mean. Now, the article that comments on this paper actually attempted to take pieces of the paper and explain it to the general public, so at least some are trying, though it seems to be written by someone who specializes more in neuroscience rather than quantum physics. Now that, of course, is not a criticism or anything. It's only to say that there's another side to this story. I personally have the opposite problem. I specialize more on the quantum physics side of things and know little to nothing about neuroscience. So between the article that I mentioned and this video, and I actually did write an article as well, I hope that we'll have a better grasp at what's really going on, so we can examine the paper and see what we can learn. The way that this other article is written, it actually takes quotes from the article and then comments on them. So I think that's probably the best way to go. I'll read what the other article says, and then I'll have my own comments on it too. So hopefully you'll get both sides, the neuroscience side and quantum physics side. Also, if you want to check out that article, I have it linked in the description below, as well as the article that I wrote. So here's the first quote from the actual paper. It says, "From topology, a strong concept comes into play in understanding brain functions, namely the 4D space of a hypersphere's torus, undetectable by observers living in a 3D world. Here we hypothesize that brain functions are embedded in an imperceptible fourth spatial dimension and propose a method to empirically assess its presence." So obviously extremely hard to understand if you're not a physicist. And now the comment that the Discover article makes, the author writes, "I must admit that I'm not sure whether Tosi and Peters literally mean that the brain is a four-dimensional object. I don't know if we are to read this paper as meaning that neural activity is in some way analogous to a hypersphere, a four-dimensional sphere, or whether we're being asked to believe that the brain actually is or contains one." So from the physics standpoint, again, this was obviously written for physicists, but basically it's saying that the researchers, Tosi and Peters, believe the actual functions of the brain either utilize or can be found in the fourth dimension of space. The best thought exercise to try and understand what a fourth dimension of space would look and behave like is that of flatland. I use it all the time. Any reader of my work or viewers of my shows should already be familiar with the concept of flatland, but for those who are new, flatland is a hypothetical two-dimensional universe inhabited by creatures called flatlanders. Flatlanders possess the ability to perceive only two dimensions, which, encompassing four directions instead of the normal six directions accessible in our three dimensions of space. So while we have up, down, left, right, forward, and backward, flatlanders only have four of those. Now, a flatlander would have no concept of up and down, and if his universe is horizontal, or he would have no concept of forward and backward if his universe is vertical. So we can ask the question: what would a three-dimensional ball, for example, look like to a flatlander if it passed through flatland? Or how would you, as a three-dimensional being, interact with a flatlander? And those are the types of questions that can help us get our heads around what dimensions are. But basically, the flatlander, if a ball was passing through flatland, the flatlander would see the ball as a circle that grows and shrinks as it enters and exits flatland space. He would see you with the same two-dimensional perspective. So we can use this as an example of how an object of 4 spatial dimensions would interact with our 3-dimensional world. If a hypersphere, which is a sphere of 4 dimensions, were to breach our space, we would see it the same as flatlanders, but only adding 1 dimension. So instead of seeing a 2-dimensional circle, we would see a 3-dimensional sphere grow and shrink as it enters and exits our space. So this can help us in trying to understand what the researchers are talking about with 4-dimensional space. Imagine if the brain functions of a flatlander actually occurred here in our 3 dimensions of space. In fact, imagine if a flatlander actually, if the flatlander brain or entire physiology actually extended into our dimension. Yet, because they still have a 2-dimensional limited perception, the flatlanders, would have no way of knowing it. They could be 3-dimensional beings, yet only believe that they're 2. So this is essentially what the paper in question suggests, that we, as 3-dimensional entities, might actually extend into the 4th spatial dimension. Though, due to our limited 3-dimensional perspective, we would never know it. We'd have no way of knowing that. So here's another quote from the article. How do thoughts flow in the brain? Current advances in neuroscience emphasize the role of energetic landscapes, a sort of functional linens equipped with peaks. That might be lines. I'm not sure if that's a misspelling or not. Valleys and basins made of free energy where thoughts move following erratic and or constrained trajectories. This review, based on recent findings, introduces the concept of a spatial 4th dimension where brain functions might take place as a general device underlying our thoughts dynamics. Wow. All right. So the Discover article, the author comments and says, this suggests that the 4th dimension is a metaphor in the same way that energy landscapes are metaphorical, not actual places. But then on the other hand, we read the following, which seems to imply that the 4th dimension is a real thing. And then they give another quote, and we'll get to that in a second, but one thing at a time. Now here I have to disagree, and I mean, I don't think that they're trying to be metaphorical here, as this suggests. I think this section is actually using the idea of the origin of thoughts to explain why a literal 4th dimension of space might be necessary. Imagine if thoughts were actually real and had physicality, yet that type of realism was completely foreign to us because of our limited 3-dimensional perspective. It would take a 4-dimensional brain, or at least a 3-dimensional brain that operates in 4 dimensions, to be able to interpret thoughts in a way that we could understand. So is it possible that these are what thoughts actually are? We can think again to the flatlander who's actually 3-dimensional but believes he's only 2-dimensional. Flatlanders would only be able to understand the 2-dimensional slice of the flatlander brain that they could physically see and study. The rest of the flatlander brain, which exists in the 3rd dimension, would be completely foreign and unknowable. Therefore, there would have to be some mechanism within the 2-dimensional part of the knowable flatlander brain to interpret everything else from its 3rd dimension in a way that the flatlander could understand. But by and large, the flatlander brain would be a mystery. It'd be very mysterious, and that's kind of what we see with our brains as well. It's very mysterious. So that's what Tozzi and Peters are suggesting for us, that maybe there's a 4th dimensional construct to our brain. Now the next quote, it says, brains equipped with a hypersphere is a counterintuitive hypothesis since we live in a 3D world with no immediate perception that 4D space exists at all. We need thus to evaluate indirect clues of the undetectable fourth dimension. The author of the Discover article says, so what's the evidence for this mysterious dimension? Tozzi and Peters say that we need to look for 3D shadows or echoes of the 4D object, and we can do this by using the Borsuk-Ulam theorem, or BUT, which they say predicts that antipodal points on the 4D brain will be activated during activity of the 3D brain as follows. And we'll get to that in just a second, but I want to comment on the other point about the imperceivable fourth dimensions. But simply enough, that section is stating that on the surface, this idea of the brain utilizing or even existing within a fourth spatial dimension is, at least on the surface, useless because we have no way of accessing the fourth dimension. So what good is that hypothesis? Though, as the researchers who wrote the paper allude to, there are other ways of testing that might provide useful results. So we'll get into that. The next quote says, the activation of a single point on the 3D brain S2 surface leads to the activation of two antipodal points on the 4D brain S3 surface, and there's a picture in this article. So again, if you go to the description, you can click on that link and check it out. In turn, the activation of two antipodal points on S3 leaves the 3D brain S2 surface hallmarks, which can be detected by current available neuroimaging techniques. Now that's, I don't know, that gets more into the neuroscience part. That's where this is where the paper really delves more into neuroscience. In that aspect of this entire hypothesis, which, as I stated, I'm not really equipped to comment on with any sort of intellectual authority. Now, it seems to me, based on what's said in the article, that at least the two researchers believe there's a way of testing the brain in order to see if it actually operates or exists within a fourth dimension of space. Now, for more on this, I would have to refer to the Discover article that was written about this paper. So the rest of that states that essentially the claim is that if an fMRI study detects activity at two opposite points on the brain, this is evidence for an unseen 4D reality. They review various resting state fMRI studies, and they report find that many of them have indeed detected antipodal activations. They illustrate this with a series of images taken from recently published papers in which black and white bars are used to depict the antipodal points. And the article actually does provide graphics that you can look at, which I'll post here. I don't know how much help that's going to be, but it's something. But again, you can go to the linked article. Now the rest of the article, the author states, I can see a few problems with this. For one thing, it's cherry picking. Every fMRI study is different to some of them. Is different, so some of them will produce antipodal patterns by chance alone. But more fundamentally, this approach ignores the facts of neuroanatomy. The brain is bilaterally symmetrical. It has a left and right hemisphere, and the corresponding points on each hemisphere are connected by the corpus callosum. For this reason, neural activity is generally symmetrical. We don't need to posit a 4D brain to explain this, yet many of the Tozzi and Peters antipodal bars can be easily explained in this manner. So I'm not convinced by this paper, but nonetheless I suspect it might become a cult classic of theoretical neuroscience, as the idea is rather gloriously weird. So that's from that article. Again, I'm not an expert in neuroscience, so I would have to defer to that. But actually, there is further hope for us to understand some more about this. I've heard that Skywatch TV's resident science expert, Sharon Gilbert, who actually does specialize in in biology sciences. We'll be covering this story with Derek Gilbert in a future episode of Sci Friday. So make sure to subscribe to the official Sci Friday YouTube channel, youtube.com/Sci Friday. SCIFRIDAY. That'll give you more information on that. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Into the Multiverse. It's a show that my wife Christina and I host together, and it's basically quantum physics in the Bible for the layman. Now, lastly, to conclude, this idea of us as human beings possibly existing in some way within an extra dimension of space, it shouldn't scare us or worry us. Now, it's true, certain New Age and Eastern sects have taken this idea and basically ran off the cliff with it, but that doesn't mean that we have to fear it or that we have to do the same thing. There might even be biblical evidences for accepting this idea, at least as a possibility, within God's grand design. Ephesians chapter 2 tells us that Christ sees us seated with him in heaven already, meaning there is a part of us that's outside of space and time. Therefore, amazingly enough, this strange idea about the brain might actually have some validity to it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we as Christians should be trying to tap into that dimension or access it or do any stuff like pineal gland or third eye stuff. The Bible forbids that stuff for a reason. So we as Christians, that's not what the point of thinking about this would be. But we can consider these possibilities and allow them to grow within us a deeper appreciation and reverence for the one true God and his amazing creative power. Now, of course, this is a fascinating concept that would be outside of our direct purposes to go too deep into here. However, if you would like more information, I can direct you to my two books, Quantum Creation and Cherubim Chariots. For these books, you can go to my website, sharpeningreport.com, or better yet, go to skywatchtvstore.com. There you will find a deal for both books. I believe it's $29.95. It's a $40 value, so it's a really good deal. And that would be the best place to get it. So skywatchtvstore.com. Check it out. All right, so that is all there is for today. Thank you for watching. Take care and God bless.